The bag sat by the door, an unremarkable satchel of worn leather, yet it held the weight of a lifetime, or perhaps the exact opposite. The weight of a life finally unburdened. It was not large, barely more than an overnight valise, but it contained everything she felt she truly owned. A book of poetry, a small framed sketch of a wild garden, a single pressed flower from a season long past, and the quiet dignity she had gathered over years of quiet observation. The great hall, usually echoing with footsteps and the low hum of servants going about their duties, was still. Too still, perhaps, for a house that had just hosted one of the season's most anticipated events, a ball whose echoes still clung to the velvet draperies and polished marble. She stood by the window, the faint light of dawn painting the ancient stones outside in shades of bruised violet and pewter. Her gaze was directed not at the fading stars, but inward, to a place where a decision had finally taken root, firm and unyielding as an oak. It had grown in the silent spaces between words, in the overlooked corners of crowded rooms, and especially in the specific rhythm of a waltz played for everyone but her. This morning, the house felt like a shell. The warmth of the previous night's revelry had dissipated, leaving behind only the chill of the stones and the faint scent of beeswax and spent candles. Lady Eleanor was not one for grand gestures. She had given herself to a life that had never once turned to look at her giving, and she had done so with a grace so profound it had rendered her invisible. The marriage, a matter of alliance and expectation, had been founded not on passion, but on the assumption of companionability, a quiet understanding that he, Lord Ashworth, would provide, and she, Lady Eleanor, would maintain. And so she had, not once, not twice, but for 10 years she had overseen the estate with an eye for detail sharper than any steward's, cultivated gardens that bloomed even in the leanest seasons, and presided over a household that ran with an almost silent precision. She had become the living architecture of his ease, the invisible hand that smoothed every wrinkle, the unheard voice that anticipated every need. He, in turn, had admired her efficiency. He had trusted her competence. He had, simply, forgotten her presence. There are stories that unfold like grand dramas, with shouted words and shattering glass, and then there are others that unfurl like a single taut thread, pulling slowly until it simply severs. This was a story of the latter kind, a quiet devastation that had been building, not in anger but in a profound and aching recognition of absence. If you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you have ever given your presence wholly and found it unreceived, then you already understand the precise architecture of her departure. It was not an escape. It was a return to herself. To truly witness this unfolding, to understand the layers of unspoken language that shaped their world and ours, you'll want to ensure you don't miss a single moment. Consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell, for this story is told in layers, and every chapter earns the next one. She did not raise her voice. She had long since learned that what truly mattered was heard in the silence, and silence, in that house, had become a language all its own. Lord Ashworth was not a cruel man. This must be stated explicitly, for cruelty would have been easier to understand, simpler to name, and perhaps even easier to forgive. He was, instead, a man shaped by expectation, heir to a lineage that valued duty above all else, where emotions were luxuries and efficiency a virtue. His father, a stern and distant figure, had instilled in him the belief that a well-ordered life was one devoid of unnecessary complication, a smoothly running engine requiring only proper maintenance. Love was not a factor in such equations. merely a pleasant byproduct if it happened to occur. His arranged marriage to Eleanor, the daughter of a neighbouring viscount, had been presented to him as a logical progression, a securing of lands and influence. He had found her agreeable, intelligent, and strikingly capable. What more could a man ask for? He had assumed her contentment, much as he assumed the sun would rise or the harvest would come. These were facts of his ordered world. For years, the rhythms of their lives had run parallel but never truly intersected. His days were filled with estate business, with political concerns in London, with the demands of his position. He would return, often late, to a house that was always perfectly managed, to dinners that were always precisely prepared, to a wife who was always quietly composed, ready with a pertinent observation about the day's affairs or a gentle query about his own. He heard her words, nodded, offered his own, and never once truly listened for the echo they left in the room or the absence they failed to fill. He did not notice the small gestures she stopped making, the particular book she no longer left open on his bedside table, the flower she stopped placing in his study, the way her hand no longer lingered when she passed him a cup of tea. It was not a deliberate withdrawal on her part, but an unacknowledged cessation of effort. She had stopped trying to connect where no connection was sought. The household staff, however, noticed. Mrs. Albright, the long-serving housekeeper whose eyes missed nothing, had seen the slow, almost imperceptible shift. She had observed the way Lady Eleanor would often take her meals alone in the smaller dining room or spend hours in the walled garden, pruning and tending with a fierce, solitary concentration. She saw the way Lord Ashworth's seat remained empty at the breakfast table more often than not, and the quiet dignity with which Eleanor never once inquired as to his whereabouts. Then there was Lady Clarissa Beaumont, a woman of dazzling wit and undeniable beauty, a new arrival in their social circle. Clarissa moved with an easy confidence, her laughter echoing freely through drawing rooms. Lord Ashworth found her company stimulating, a refreshing counterpoint to the quiet efficiency he had come to expect at home. He would engage her in long, animated conversations about politics and philosophy, debates that sparked and crackled. Clarissa was not malicious. She simply shone where others had learned to dim themselves. And in her light, Lord Ashworth's blindness to his own wife's quietude became, for the observant, even more pronounced. He spent hours, not once, not twice, but throughout the season discoursing with Clarissa, oblivious to the fact that Eleanor was often in the same room, listening. Her presence was a given. Clarissa's was a novelty. That, for him, made all the difference. The ball had been a grand affair, as anticipated. Hundreds of candles illuminated the ballroom, their flickering light reflecting off polished floors and the jewels of the assembled guests. Musicians played a lively waltz, filling the air with a rhythm that compelled movement. Lord Ashworth, as host, moved through the room with characteristic ease, exchanging pleasantries, discussing matters of state, and charming every lady who crossed his path. He danced with Lady Harrington, a widow with a sharp mind. He danced with the young Miss Davies, whose debutante season it was. He danced a lively set with Lady Clarissa Beaumont, their conversation flowing as easily as their steps, their laughter clear and uninhibited. Lady Eleanor, in a gown of deep emerald silk that blended subtly with the background of the estate, observed him from a quiet alcove. She had arrived, performed her hostess duties with practiced grace, greeted their guests, and then receded. She had not expected him to seek her out for the first dance, nor even the second. That expectation had withered years ago. But as the evening wore on, as the music swirled and the faces blurred, a particular truth began to solidify in her mind, not like a sudden revelation, but like the slow, inevitable freezing of water into ice. He had danced with every lady. His duty, his charm, his attention had been offered freely to every woman in the room, it seemed, but his own wife. Not once had his gaze lingered. Not once had he offered his hand. Not once had he sought her out amidst the swirling gaiety. She watched, and the ache was not of jealousy, but of a deeper, more profound loneliness. It was the simple, undeniable confirmation that she was not merely overlooked, but truly, truly absent from his consciousness. She did not cry. She had moved past crying. What she felt instead was a clarity, cold and sharp as the winter air. This was not anger. This was a decision, a precise, quiet decision. She remained until the last guest had departed, her smile unwavering, her farewells impeccable. She ensured the household staff knew exactly what was needed for the morning after. Then, as the first grey light began to touch the windows, she walked to her chambers. She did not open her journal. She did not sit by the fire. She simply began to pack the small, worn, leather bag. Each item placed inside was a testament to the life she was choosing to reclaim, not discard. Lord Ashworth, by contrast, woke late. The echoes of the ball were still in his mind, a pleasant hum of success. He felt satisfied. It had been a good night. He expected Eleanor to be at breakfast, perhaps already tending to the morning's correspondence, but her chair was empty. Not a striking absence, perhaps, as she sometimes took an early ride or walked the gardens, but as the day wore on, and her usual presence did not materialize, a faint unease began to settle. He inquired of Mrs. Albright. "Lady Eleanor is not in the house, my lord," she said, her voice neutral, her gaze unwavering. "She left this morning. A letter awaits you in your study." He stood there, by the empty breakfast table, a slice of toast forgotten in his hand. It was not a grand event, this knowledge. It was simply a fact. And the weight of it, the absolute stillness it imposed on the familiar rhythms of his day, was more unsettling than any shouted accusation could have been. The silence of the house, which had once been the backdrop to his comfort, now began to feel like a judgment. The letter was brief, precise, and utterly devoid of recrimination. There were no accusations, no declarations of heartbreak. It simply stated that she was taking leave, that she needed time to herself, and that she would correspond when she felt ready. There was no address given, only the assurance that the estate and his comfort would continue to be managed by the capable hands of Mrs. Albright and the steward. Lord Ashworth read it not once, not twice, but until the words blurred on the page. He felt not anger, but a hollow, gnawing emptiness, a sensation he was entirely unaccustomed to. He had been so proud of his ordered world, and now the most vital piece of its architecture had simply, quietly, removed itself. He found himself wandering the house, a ghost in his own grand dwelling. He saw the piano in the drawing room, closed and silent, where Eleanor had occasionally played gentle melodies. He saw the book she had been reading, left face down on a side table, a sprig of dried lavender marking her place. He saw the empty chairs, the quiet garden where no figure pruned the roses. He began to notice all the small, named things that had been her steady, invisible presence. And he understood, with a dawning, terrible clarity, that these were not mere objects, but the physical manifestation of a woman who had, for 10 years, given herself entirely and received nothing in return but benign neglect. He had watched the ball, confident in his own social brilliance, oblivious to the fact that the most important presence in the room had become an absence. He had danced with every lady but her, and she had seen it all. Weeks passed. Then a month. The silence in Ashworth Manor grew not louder but deeper. Lord Ashworth began to write long, halting letters to the only address he had, her solicitors. He did not beg, he did not demand. He simply stated with increasing honesty the things he was learning about his own blindness, his own comfortable assumptions. He did not expect forgiveness. He simply finally began to understand. It was not a joyous reunion. There was no sudden embrace, no tearful confession. It was rather a conversation held in a small, rented cottage by the sea, where Eleanor had found a quiet solace. She sat across from him, the same composed woman he remembered, yet subtly changed, the stillness now feeling like strength rather than endurance. "I did not realize," he said, his voice raw. The words felt inadequate, but they were the truth. She looked at him, her gaze direct. "No," she confirmed, "you did not." "I was wrong," he continued, a confession he had rarely uttered in his life. "About everything that mattered." "Perhaps not everything," she replied, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth in her eyes. "But about us, yes." He waited. He had learned in her absence to wait, to listen. "I am not asking you to return as you were," he said, the words carefully chosen. "I am asking if you might return as we could be. If you would teach me how to see." She smiled then, and this time it was not the composed, unreadable smile of the hostess, but the kind that held both reservation and a fragile hope, the kind that was earned, not performed. The bag that had once sat by the door of Ashworth Manor, holding the sum of her reclaimed self, now sat open on the floor of the cottage. It was not empty, and as he watched her, truly watched her, for perhaps the first time in their marriage, he understood that her return would not be a victory for him, but a beginning for them both. She had left without looking back, and he had watched the whole way, and in that watching, he had finally begun to see what had been lost. Their story, like all true stories of connection, was not about perfection, but about the hard, quiet work of finally seeing one another. Thank you for leaning in, for listening to the spaces between the words, and for journeying with us through this quiet devotion. If this story resonated, remember to like, share, and comment below with your own thoughts on the silent languages of love and loss. We are all, in some measure, trying to be seen.